We're here today to celebrate a very significant contribution from the United States government to the humanitarian organizations here in South Sudan, notably the World Food Programme, and also the High Commission for Refugees. This generous contribution comes at a very critical juncture for South Sudan, a time when the country faces very serious food insecurity, some 60% of the population of South Sudan facing severe acute food insecurity and malnutrition this lean season. 60% of the population, so 7.24 million people, really in trouble this lean season. So these funds come at a very important time. They are part of a consistent, predictable support from the government of the United States to the people of South Sudan through, in this case, the World Food Programme. The $345 million that the ambassador will announce is going to be used, and has in some cases already started to be used, for our general food distribution programs that seek to support the most needy, the most vulnerable in the country. They support our resilience building activities, the activities that we run in rural communities and urban communities to try and help communities and people to get back on their own 2 feet, to support themselves, to make a living for their own families. It supports asset building that can help communities to be more shock resistant when shocks come to their community. It also supports our interagency facilitation to other organizations through the logistics cluster and the United Nations Humanitarian Air Service that the World Food Programme manages in South Sudan. Accumulation of shocks, and the people of South Sudan are suffering from an accumulation of shocks over the last few years, whether it be climate change, with the 2 years of unprecedented flooding that the country has faced, whether it's economic decline caused by the depreciation of the South Sudanese pound, the very significant increase in the cost of food in the country, and of course what has happened because of COVID-19 in terms of the interruption to supply chains and that impact on the cost of living in the country. But it also comes as a cause of very significant subnational conflict here in South Sudan. Conflict that has been raging in parts of the country where we see the very worst of food insecurity today. So these causes mean that there are 10 areas of the country, 10 counties in the country, where we see absolute severe emergency levels of food insecurity, and in some cases, in some areas, the risk of catastrophic food insecurity. These shocks have caused an interruption to people's livelihoods. It's meant that they've not been able to carry out their work, whether in the fields, in agriculture, or in their villages. It stopped planting last year. It interrupted harvesting. The floods caused crops to rot in the fields before they were able to be taken into people's homes. It meant that livestock were lost to raids, lost to killing, lost to disease because of the floods, even drowned because of the flooding. So these US government support funds will bring hope to the people of South Sudan. They bring hope that not only will it enable organizations like the World Food Programme and our partners to bring emergency assistance to the most vulnerable, to the most needy, but it also brings hope because it allows us to really support the resilience building, the livelihoods building of communities who want to and should be able to look after their own families and look after their own communities. But ladies and gentlemen, let me be very clear, we're not out of the woods yet. As you know, because of this very significant food insecurity in 2021, as a cause of these accumulated shocks, these accumulated problems that the country has faced, we are having to take painful decisions right now to stretch the resources we have as far as possible. You will have seen that we are having to reduce some of the rations to some communities in the country, to displaced communities, to refugee communities. And we know that that will have an impact on their well-being, that will have an impact on their lives. It's a painful decision, and it's a decision we take because we are still very significantly short of both food and funds for our programs this year. So we are calling on other donors to show the levels of generosity that the United States are showing today. This $345 million that brings hope and brings life, a lifeline to the people of South Sudan, needs to be supplemented, needs to be augmented by others. We're also calling on communities and the government to support the peace initiatives in the country, the initiatives that will give us the conditions in South Sudan to help people help themselves and help us, the international community, to reach those who are the furthest behind, in the most remote corners of the country where they are suffering most. But we also call on the government to support, in particular, the displaced communities and the refugee communities who are going to take on this burden, who have to take on this burden when we have reduced their rations, because very clearly we are having to take from the hungry in order to ensure we can feed the starving. So we're asking for the government to support those areas by providing those communities with more land so that they can grow more food for themselves, whether they are refugees that South Sudan is kindly hosting in this country, or whether they are displaced South Sudanese who cannot yet go home to their own land, their own place of residence. Once again, I'd like to thank the US government for this incredibly important contribution, this contribution that came at a very timely, in a timely manner, so that we could help to pre-position commodities in areas of the country that will soon become cut off because of the rains. This is a predictable and consistent supporter to the people of South Sudan, and a predictable, consistent supporter of the United Nations mandate in this country to end hunger. Thank you very much.
South Sudan is at a critical point for humanitarian assistance. The humanitarian needs arising from severe, acute food insecurity at likely famine levels, that means starvation, have been compounded by political and intercommunal violence and successive years of flooding. The technical term of food insecurity, what does that mean? That means hunger, that means malnutrition, and ultimately that means starvation. South Sudan is facing the highest levels of food insecurity and malnutrition since independence in 2011, with the upcoming May to July lean season expected to be the most severe on record. Approximately 7.7 million South Sudanese, nearly 2/3 of the population of this country, will require food assistance, including an estimated 1.4 million children who are experiencing acute malnutrition. The government of South Sudan is a vital partner in responding to the humanitarian needs of vulnerable South Sudanese, and generously hosts some 317,000 refugees from neighboring countries. That's an important point. South Sudan generates refugees, South Sudan hosts refugees. The United States greatly appreciates partnership with the government of South Sudan and with the UN agencies, World Food Program and United Nations High Commission for Refugees, in responding to this urgent situation. The United States is working with government authorities at all levels to ensure the full, free, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance to those who need it most. Persistent insecurity, intercommunal conflict, and deliberate attacks against humanitarian aid workers and humanitarian aid assets are exacerbating humanitarian needs and preventing life-saving food and nutrition assistance from reaching the most vulnerable. That link between conflict and hunger needs to be well understood. We are deeply concerned by the increase in the scale, intensity, and geographic spread of conflict in this country. Conflict adversely affects food production by preventing farmers from cultivating their crops. It disrupts livelihoods and leads to depleted household food stocks. The loss of assets also creates incentives for people who become desperate and engage themselves in armed violence when they have no other choice, perpetuating a vicious cycle in which conflict and hunger are mutually reinforcing. The country does not need that. Bureaucratic impediments also hinder humanitarian operations and prevent people from accessing assistance. So when donors and the agencies go to make great efforts to get the food to the people, there can be bureaucratic impediments to achieving that end. Protection of aid workers and removal of these impediments, of these barriers to accessing humanitarian assistance is essential to help communities recover and build resilience to future shocks. And as you think of a household, a rural household, you want them to be able to have stores they can depend on and build up for the next lean season. We call on the government of South Sudan to do everything in its power to protect humanitarian workers and improve humanitarian access and expedite delivery of urgently needed food to vulnerable South Sudanese citizens. Today, I announce more than $95 million in new funding, that's fresh funding, as part of the $482 million provided by the American people to the people of South Sudan since the 1st of October of last year. On behalf of the American people, this funding will provide critical protection, economic opportunity, shelter, essential health care, emergency food assistance, safe drinking water, sanitation and hygiene services to vulnerable people, refugees, and host communities in South Sudan and the region. This funding includes more than $52 million from the U.S. Agency for International Development's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, represented here by my colleague, McDonald Homer. This includes support for the World Food Program to provide urgent food, nutrition, and other assistance for the people of South Sudan who are affected by ongoing conflict and are facing extreme food insecurity, including likely famine. Famine, we're talking starvation. A truly tragic situation. The funding also includes nearly $43 million from the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. This life-saving assistance is vital for the survival of nearly 4 million refugees and internally displaced people, in addition to their host communities in Uganda, Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. For that, the cooperation that we have on that assistance, I want to thank Mr. Arafat Jamal here with us today. While South Sudan remains the largest refugee-producing country in the entire African continent, with 2.2 million refugees in the surrounding countries, it also generously hosts 317,000 refugees from the surrounding countries, alongside 1.6 million internally displaced South Sudanese citizens. So these people who are seeking protection, they are not so much in a position to be producing food in a country that has the enormous agricultural potential of South Sudan. The American people have been supporting those seeking international protection since well before South Sudan's independence. We greatly appreciate our partnership with UNHCR to provide this vital assistance to refugees. I'm thankful that UNHCR representative of South Sudan, Arafat Jamal, is again with us here today. With this $95 million in new funding, the United States will provide emergency assistance to address acute needs of the most vulnerable people in South Sudan, including refugees and internally displaced people located in remote parts of South Sudan. To address the ongoing food insecurity crisis, World Food Program will use this funding to reach more than 4.1 million people with food aid. My colleagues tell me that they have provided you fact sheets, so you don't have to worry about all of these numbers I'm giving you because they will be in the fact sheets. This support includes more than 8,600 metric tons of sorghum grown by South Sudanese farmers. So from your country's food surplus areas, purchasing from your farmers to bring South Sudanese grown food to South Sudanese in need. World Food Program also supports transportation for critical humanitarian assistance by air, river, and road to reach the people who need it most. This assistance comes as needs are among the greatest they have ever been in your young country's history. In December 2020, global experts warned that famine was likely occurring in western areas of Jonglei State's Pibor County. It is the second time in 4 years that South Sudan has experienced starvation and extremely critical levels of acute malnutrition. This occurs in a country endowed with rich soil, abundant rainfall, and enormous agricultural potential. You should not be a food deficit country. And the prime culprit for the fact that this is a food deficit country, despite your enormous agricultural potential, is conflict. While U.S. humanitarian partners, including World Food Program, are scaling up emergency food and nutrition assistance to the counties experiencing the most immense catastrophic conditions, persistent insecurity and flood-related road closures continue to limit humanitarian access to some areas. The United States is the single largest donor to the South Sudan crisis response, providing nearly $5.6 billion in humanitarian aid to support vulnerable people in South Sudan and South Sudanese refugees in neighboring countries since the beginning of the civil war in December 2013. U.S. support has been key in preventing an even worse humanitarian situation, including rolling back famine in 2017. This includes distributing cash transfers and food vouchers to help families purchase what they need most while bolstering local markets. Providing approximately 198,000 metric tons of food in 2020 alone. This includes food purchased from local producers in South Sudan, as well as farmers across the region and farmers back in the United States. Providing nutrition supplements and supporting the treatment of severe acute malnutrition, supporting malnutrition screening, prevention, and treatment, including providing fortified foods to women and children, as well as counseling caregivers on best dietary, feeding, sanitation, and hygiene practices. Helping farming communities improve agricultural production by providing them with training, seeds, and tools, and providing multi-sectoral response to refugees inside South Sudan. U.S. government partners are also helping communities move beyond a critical need for humanitarian aid and assume greater responsibility in shaping their own future. World Food Program is a key partner supporting sustainability in South Sudan by boosting community and household level resilience so that families are better equipped to weather future shocks. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees is helping equip refugees with vocational training and farming skills to achieve self-reliance. To date, in 2021, U.S. support to World Food Program has enabled them to deliver more than 155,000 metric tons of food and more than 10,000 metric tons of nutrition supplies to South Sudanese citizens in need. U.S. support also allows World Food Program to purchase grain from local, regional, and international growers, including buying more than 8,600 metric tons of locally grown sorghum from RENC. World Food Program also procured a total of 40,000 metric tons of locally grown sorghum from RENC. In addition, the United States is supporting the World Food Program-led logistics cluster to transport food, medical supplies, and other assistance by air, river, and road to reach the people most in need with life-saving assistance, including in very remote, hard-to-reach areas. The urgent humanitarian need in South Sudan requires sustained and coordinated donor support and close partnership with South Sudan officials at all levels. We too call upon our fellow donors to step up to address this severe emergency that South Sudan is facing. We call on the government of South Sudan and donors to work with the United Nations and international community to support the humanitarian response in South Sudan. The government of South Sudan's role in this is key. Humanitarian assistance will not solve conflicts that generate so much hunger and death of the South Sudanese people. Ultimately, political will and political solutions are the ways to end the suffering of the South Sudanese people. That includes the full implementation of the peace agreement. We look forward to continuing our strong partnership with World Food Program, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and the government of South Sudan at all levels for the benefit of the South Sudanese people. I thank you, and I look forward to your questions, and apologies if I went on too long.
Lift the arms embargo on South Sudan. Here in Juba, the government is saying they cannot graduate forces and form a national army, which is a benchmark for the revitalized peace agreement. That's one. Two, related to the peace agreement, any commitment to support the implementation of the revitalized peace agreement. So are you ready to support the implementation of peace agreement? So that at least, thank you.
I think we can.
So as I understood, the first question had to do with your country's oil resources and the government institutions that are responsible for managing those resources on behalf of all South Sudanese people. In the peace agreement, there is a specific chapter on public financial management that calls for full transparency and publishing of figures and sharing information with the South Sudanese citizens about government income and expenditures that would be inclusive of, but not solely focused on the oil sector. So when we speak of full implementation of the peace agreement, that means across the board. And the public financial management chapter is a good example of something which can be fully implemented by the government of South Sudan without the involvement of your country's foreign friends. And that would give the ability of South Sudanese citizens to review how their resources are being managed. Then I got questions about the peace agreement. I do not consider questions about conflict and the peace agreement off topic. It is very much on topic. When we are talking about hunger and malnutrition, food insecurity, displacement, I would say that conflict is not the only driver of food insecurity, of hunger, but it is the prime driver in this country at this time. So, I first came to your country in 2011, shortly after independence. Some of you may recall the late Ambassador Special Envoy Princeton Lyman. I was his deputy, and so I traveled here with him and met many of your leaders. And I also came here for extended periods to serve as chargé d'affaires at the United States Embassy in South Sudan, just as I am now. I have had the privilege of traveling throughout your country, and I have seen where, despite the very rich soil, abundant rainfall, that the country has a persistent food shortage, but there is no weapons shortage. There's a weapons surplus. So this idea that the UN Security Council must lift the arms embargo in order for the peace agreement to be fully implemented because there aren't enough guns in your country, that's not what I've seen. I've seen that there's lots of guns. So I ask you to reconsider the premise of that question. I know that there are discussions in New York amongst the members of the United Nations Security Council on what the benchmarks are. We want South Sudan to achieve a normal and peaceful and stable situation. And part of that is the unified military, which is called for in the peace agreement. And so at some point, lifting of the embargo would make sense, but we need, the UN Security Council, as I said, is discussing what the benchmarks would be that could then be communicated to the government. The idea that it is the responsibility of South Sudan's foreign friends to implement the peace agreement, that's a premise that I also think deserves some reconsideration. There are plenty of elements of the peace agreement that have not yet been implemented that requires no input, resources or otherwise, from your country's foreign friends. I'll say that again. There are unimplemented aspects of the peace agreement that can be done as soon as the political will is located without the assistance of your foreign friends. And if you want to attract more support, then the way to do that is by fully implementing those aspects. When it becomes obvious to your foreign friends that you've done everything within your power, and the only thing that is remaining to be implemented is from lack of resources, that would attract resources. As it is now, there are plenty of unimplemented aspects of the peace agreement that do not require outside involvement. They do not require the assistance or resources of your foreign friends. It is within the power of South Sudanese.
And then these ones we give them under our general food assistance. And also to prevent malnutrition from happening and to elevate it, we also give this, the super cereal. This is called super cereal plus because it is already blended. All they need is just to boil water and mix it. So this is also given to prevent malnutrition among children and mothers, as well as the pregnant and the lactating ones. So this is what we give in a normal situation within our areas of operation as we expand to respond to the emerging needs.